Oh, hi! You caught me surfing. Speaking of being an utter badass on the ocean, let's talk about Aquaman and when he became so cool.
Comic tropes. Comic tropes.
Hello! Welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris, aka Fat Aquaman, aka Fatquaman. When it comes to talking about Aquaman, that's a character with a challenged reputation. These days, if we see him in the movies, he's played as a hulking badass by Jason Momoa. But that's based on one particular iteration of the comic book Aquaman, and there have actually been 4 separate origins or iterations of Aquaman. Also on top of that, the Super Friends cartoon seems to have deeply embedded itself within the public conscience. So when we think of Aquaman, we're often thinking of the guy that rides on dolphins and talks to, I don't know, crabs. So it's a tough character to truly comprehend. But today I want to talk about the version that turned him into a long-haired, bearded badass that was guided almost entirely by writer Peter David over a 4-year run that was very popular with fans, but was only a modest hit. There's a lot to get into there. It isn't a perfect comic, but there is a lot to recommend about it. Let's dig in. First, let's look at 3 origins of Aquaman and how the badass one stands out as the most unique. In the Golden Age, Aquaman debuted in 1941's More Fun Comics number 73, an anthology title, by creators Mort Weisinger and Paul Norris. He was a human being. His father was an underwater explorer, and his mother died when Aquaman was young. His father discovered Atlantis, built himself a house there, and taught himself how to breathe underwater. This and other undisclosed scientific secrets allowed Aquaman to also breathe underwater, and he also spoke to sea creatures in their own language for up to a minute at a time, somewhat like Dr. Dolittle. When I was a kid, I remember hearing stories that parents were angry at the Superman comics because their kid jumped off the shed roof trying to fly, and so they blamed the Superman comics for that. But I always wondered, how true could that story really be? Because I don't remember any kids trying to breathe underwater because they read an Aquaman story. Aquaman became one of the features of Adventure Comics in 1946 and continued to appear throughout the 40s and 50s. In 1959's Adventure Comics number 260, a new version of Aquaman's origin was presented. This was the Silver Age, and DC had established parallel universes, so this version looked and acted the same, but was given a very different origin, and the one most people are familiar with. This time, Aquaman's father was a lighthouse keeper named Tom Curry, who had rescued Atlanta, an exiled woman from Atlantis. They named their son Arthur Curry, and he inherited Atlanta's abilities. He also now spoke with sea life telepathically. Atlanta died when Aquaman was young, and Tom Curry remarried and had a human son named Orm that was deeply jealous of Aquaman and designed a suit to breathe underwater and tried to conquer Atlantis. Aquaman also gained a weakness like Superman's kryptonite or Green Lantern's color yellow. If he wasn't in contact with water for an hour, he got weak and could die. I never liked that idea that Aquaman needed a weakness added to him. The idea that he had to be in touch with water once an hour, Aquaman did not need a weakness. But the one thing it did do was highlight that he was a child of 2 worlds, the underwater Atlantis world and, the above world that we all live in. One thing that the Silver Age Aquaman had going for him was some great artwork. There was artwork by Ramona Fradon, one of the few popular female artists in the 60s and 70s. There was Nick Cardy. He did some beautiful artwork on Aquaman. And this was the era where they introduced a lot of Aquaman's supporting cast. There was Mira, his eventual wife from another dimension. There was Aqua Baby, their son. There was Aqualad, Arthur's sidekick, Arthur Curry's sidekick, and, a few other important Atlanteans. And that helped give him more of a world to exist in. So that was a strong point. By the late 70s, Aquaman's stories became surprisingly serious. His enemy Black Manta killed his infant son in the Death of a Prince storyline, and his wife Mira had a falling out with Aquaman over this. After these strong storylines, Aquaman was a bit directionless. His solo title was cancelled, and his appearances were regulated to mostly acting as the leader of the Justice League during a time when that title wasn't very popular. They were based in Detroit, of all places, and were full of new characters like Gypsy and Vibe, who never really took off in a big way. That shift in tone can almost give you whiplash. The Aquaman from the 40s through the 60s was really created for kids. I mean, he had fun storylines where he had a pet octopus named Topo that he taught how to play drums, and then all of a sudden in the 70s, you've got his infant son being killed and his wife leaving him. It's very different, and it sort of speaks to how there was never really a strong editorial direction for Aquaman. They didn't necessarily ever know where to guide that character. And finally, it became 1985. DC used the Crisis on Infinite Earths storyline to reboot their entire superhero universe, and Aquaman was given a third origin. In 1986, Aquaman had a 4-issue limited series written by Neil Posner, who expanded on Atlantis and added the element that it had sorcerers. Aquaman was also given a new blue camouflage outfit that was a hit, but it didn't stick around for long. However, it did eventually become the uniform for Aquaman's evil doppelganger from the Netherworld dimension, Thanatos. Sales were only okay, and Aquaman hung around the periphery of DC, appearing in their Invasion storyline in 1988 in his traditional orange and green suit. In 1989, writer Robert Loren Fleming completely updated Aquaman's origin in a special issue which featured some gorgeous finished artwork by Kurt Swan. Aquaman's birth name was now Orin, and his mother Atlana was the Queen of Atlantis, making him royalty. Atlana was impregnated by the evil immortal sorcerer Atlan in her dreams. That's called rape. Atlan later has another child with an Inupiat woman. This is the modern-age version of Orm, who later becomes Ocean Master. Aquaman is born with blonde hair, which the Atlanteans are superstitious about. In their past, Queen Korra had given birth to Kordax, who had blonde hair and green scales, and attacked Atlantis. So when Aquaman is born with blonde hair, Atlana's husband determines that he should be cast out. Scientist Vulko argues that it's just superstition, but he's ignored. Vulko would go on to be one of Aquaman's most trusted advisors. The infant Aquaman is left at Mercy Reef, which is above the water at low tide. But Aquaman is able to breathe above water, unlike other Atlanteans, and he survives. He is raised by dolphins, and as a young boy, he's discovered by lighthouse keeper Arthur Curry and given the same name. When he becomes a teenager, he journeys to Alaska and ultimately learns about his Atlantean heritage and returns to claim the throne. The rest of Aquaman's Silver Age stories remained in place as his backstory, including that he lost his son to Black Manta and that his wife Mera had left him. But in the 90s, he was given a new look, a new direction, and a lot more backstory. And most of that came from writer Peter David. At this point, he'd established himself at Marvel, writing some Spider-Man stories, and he'd begun a successful run on The Incredible Hulk. In 1990, David laid the groundwork for his later run on Aquaman by writing a 7-issue series called The Atlantis Chronicles. Each issue was written from the point of view of an Atlantean tasked with documenting their history, and the issues covered the beginnings of Atlantis up to the birth of Aquaman. It told the story of two brothers, Orin and Shalako, who would go on to become the first king and a high priest of Atlantis, a city with both advanced technology and a history of sorcery. Shalako cursed the city to fall beneath the sea, but the city remained sealed and safe for a time. Eventually, technology enables the Atlanteans to change their physiology so that they can survive underwater. The book cast Atlantis as the setting of ancient family squabbles over who should rule and how. It provided a great backstory that made the underwater kingdom itself finally become a character. Its history entwined powerful magic and political machinations and added a new layer to Aquaman's books. If you've read any of Peter David's stuff like The Hulk, X Factor, even Aquaman, you know that he has a reputation for using a lot of jokey dialogue and humor. But the Atlantis Chronicles doesn't really go that direction at all. Sometimes Peter David can be quite serious, like in the Spider-Man story that he wrote, The Death of Jean DeWolf. And the Atlantis Chronicles is much more in that vein. It's fantastic. It's not required reading if you want to read Peter David's later Aquaman run, but I think it will inform and reward you as a reader if you read that backstory to the Kingdom of Atlantis. I don't think that Aquaman as a title has ever had a great run. I think the Peter David run is very good. I think that the Atlantis Chronicles is great, but it isn't really an Aquaman story. It's more like Aquaman tangential. Following the Atlantis Chronicles, Peter David wrote a 4-issue Aquaman series called Time and Tide in late 1993 through 1994 that summarizes Aquaman's origin and key plot points. There was an existing Aquaman title that ran for 13 issues, but it wasn't a big hit, and DC decided to restart a new volume with Peter David writing it. And that's where Aquaman's look and personality became something closer to what we're seeing being used in the current movies as well as in animated appearances. In Time and Tide, Aquaman learns that his father was the evil wizard Atlan, who also fathered Ocean Master. So when the Aquaman monthly title begins, he's been sulking in his aqua cave for months, growing bitter and resentful of his past. He begins the story with a beard and long hair, and is only drawn out on an adventure at the pleading of Aqualad, his former sidekick. They go up against an eco-terrorist who temporarily absorbs Aquaman's powers. In issue 2, this villain forces Aquaman's hand into a river full of piranha, which destroy his left hand. He decides to replace it with a harpoon as a symbol of what he's gone through. This visual change was a bit controversial at the time. This was a point when DC was giving us a new Superman, a new Batman, a new Wonder Woman, a new Green Lantern. So the idea to completely change Aquaman's look, it was seen as just an attempt to grab readers' attention. And maybe it was, but I think if you separate it from the history of what was going on at the time and you just read the self-contained, roughly 4-issue storyline by Peter David, it does make a type of sense in context and it doesn't stand out as especially egregious. David wanted to ditch Aquaman's previous image, and his first several issues feature Aquaman going up against Superboy and Lobo, 2 very powerful characters, and holding his own. In a battle with Superboy, he's tossed around a bit, but comes back with a tsunami he forms by guiding gigantic blue whales to create it, and has a relatively iconic line, "Hey punk, impressed yet?" The following issue involves Lobo hunting fishermen that wounded one of his space dolphins, the only thing he cares about. He shreds Aquaman's old uniform, but teams up when he learns Aquaman was raised by dolphins. There's also a new supporting character added to the series, named Dolphin. Dolphin was a character created in 1968 by writer-artist J. Scott Pike. She was a human who fell off a cruise ship but was rescued by aliens who gave her gills and webbed fingers and toes. She was not used in a lot of DC comics until Peter David added her to the cast of Aquaman, and she befriends and falls in love with Aquaman. Honestly, Dolphin doesn't do a lot for me as a character. I don't feel like she has a lot in terms of direction. She doesn't seem to have any goals. She's just sort of hanging out with Aquaman and falls in love with him pretty quickly. Her costume, if you want to call it that, is just a white tank top and cut-off denim shorts, which doesn't really make a lot of sense as an underwater costume. I don't feel like that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'm overthinking it. It is comic books. They could have done something better visually. Eventually, 2 years into the run, Dolphin starts making a little more sense. Peter David reveals that the villain Kordax had mind-controlled Dolphin and sent her to initiate herself into Aquaman's life and eventually kill him, but she falls in love. And honestly, at that point, it starts feeling a lot like Mira's story. Mira was also sent to originally kill Aquaman, but fell in love with him. But she then falls in love with Aqualad, and at that point, she sort of goes in her own direction. And I think it makes a lot more sense about 2 years in. After Aquaman's suit is ruined by Lobo, he begins wearing a gladiatorial manica and has Star Labs create a cybernetic harpoon that is retractable and responds to his mental commands. This Aquaman is gruff, impatient, and confident in his power. The first 2 years of the title build up to a story in which Aquaman unites the 5 lost cities of Atlantis and repels an alien invasion with the help of his supporting cast. It's fairly impressive. Aquaman doesn't call on the Justice League to help him with this alien invasion. He handles it himself. And one of the nice things about this run is that it's pretty much self-contained. It doesn't have a lot of distractions of crossovers. So that is a strong plus point to it. That said, it does end rather abruptly. Peter David planned for Aquaman to discover that he's a water elemental, capable of connecting with all sea life. This ties into other DC Comics mythology. Animal Man can connect to the red, or all animal life. Swamp Thing can connect to the green, or all plant life. In issue 36, Aquaman learns he can connect with the clear, all sea life. It was building up to a story in which Aquaman would be killed by the sea god Triton, battle his way back to life, and return as an elemental, with Tempest as the new king of Atlantis and Aquaman as a type of emissary that went on adventures. But behind the scenes, Peter David was starting to become annoyed at editorial interference. He was given a lot of contradictory directions, like make Aquaman a leader, but also send him on more solo adventures in his book. Have more political intrigue, but don't feature Atlantis as the setting too often. So he got frustrated, and instead of building up to issue 50, he ended the story at issue 46. It just sort of ends very, very quickly. Instead of an epic conclusion in issue 50, Aquaman gets killed by Triton, but is back to life the next issue after punching out the ferryman into the river Styx. And then DC killed off Aquaman shortly after Peter David left. The strong points are the new look and attitude for both Aquaman and Tempest, the former Aqualad. There's a great deal of work put into developing Atlantis and the Atlantean supporting cast and focusing on political jockeying. There's some great superhero action and some fantastic ideas with sorcery and being an elemental. The artwork is fine. Most of the artwork in Peter David's run was done by two artists. There's Martin Edgeland, who I haven't really seen do much else, and Jim Califor, who I slightly prefer. I think that Califor can do a little bit better with the sea life. I think it's a little more realistic, and I just tend to like his style a little bit more. Edgeland, it isn't bad. It's more than readable. You know, it's perfectly serviceable. I just don't personally happen to love his sort of cartoony style, and if I'm going to deliver a knock against the artwork, I also feel that his backgrounds can be pretty minimal, and every once in a while I can literally forget whether a scene is supposed to be set underwater. So all that said, do I recommend Peter David's run? Well, maybe. You know, you've heard what I like and what I don't like. One thing that I do like is that it's very self-contained. The character is well defined. He's given some clear motivation. He's got objectives that he goes after. He is definitely built up to be a cool character. There's not a lot of distractions from crossovers or anything like that. On the downside, it ends kind of abruptly. Some of the ideas that are introduced, like being a water elemental, are never really followed up on, and the artwork is only okay, in my opinion. I definitely recommend the Atlantis Chronicles. That comic is fantastic. It's a good story with great art by Spanish artist Esteban Morado. Aquaman next appeared in a big way after DC rebooted themselves again with the New 52 era. This is the fourth take on Aquaman, and most of the issues have been written by Jeff Johns. Aquaman has his serious, fiery demeanor, but he wears his orange and green suit with short blonde hair. He's once again the son of Atlanta and lighthouse keeper Tom Curry. It's mostly a remix of the best ideas from Aquaman's past, including their take on Atlantis' history, Ocean Master's attempts to rule it, and his relationship with Mira, as well as long-lost Atlantean cultures and cities. It also lowers his telepathic connection with sea life, saying that he can push and influence them, but they generally aren't smart enough to truly command. If I compare all the versions of Aquaman, my favorite is Peter David's, but that's not necessarily saying a lot because I don't absolutely love the other versions. But your mileage may vary. I know that Aquaman definitely has his passionate fans, and I completely respect that. At this point, I think that Jeff Johns' remix, while it doesn't necessarily excite me, I think it probably is the best way to take the best elements from Aquaman's past so that he's got a good foundation for other writers to build upon. I think that the Peter David story has some great standard superhero action and adventure. The artwork might only be okay, but it's more than readable. It's definitely unique and stands out from the other Aquaman stories, and I think it really focuses on making Aquaman the central character, and it gives us a really interesting take on Atlantis, his kingdom, his past. So if I were to rate it, I'd probably give it something like a B- to a B, depending on the story arc. There's a couple areas, like when he fights off the alien invasion around issue 26, I'd probably give that something more like a B+. There are good elements within it. I wanted to focus mostly on where this idea of Aquaman, I was about to say Batman, excuse me, the idea of Aquaman as a rugged badass, where did that come from? And honestly, that primarily came from Peter David's imagination, and it seems to be the take that most people have fallen in love with. People like Aquaman as more of a tough guy and less of a guy that just rides on dolphins and teaches his pets to play the drums. Who knows? Let's see if we got any fan art this week. Nope, no fan art this week. Got a ton of emails. I just went through them all. None of them had fan art. That's fine. But if you would like to send in fan art, something related to this channel, just send it to this address, comictropes@gmail.com. Include anything like links to your social media or a website if you want that included. And I'll show whatever artwork comes in. And I will then draw one lucky winner to win a Gachapon prize. I picked a bunch of Gachapons up in Japan, and I give one away every week. This Gachaponi machine was given to us by Lunar Shines, and I believe that they have some sort of special event going on in December, so you might want to check out their website. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I don't know, I haven't seen the Aquaman movie yet. It's still about a week out, but it kind of looks like it could be fun. James Wan, the director, has done some pretty good movies outside of this, so, fingers crossed that maybe we finally get some sort of iconic interpretation of Aquaman that we can enjoy and respect. We'll see. Aquaman has a challenged reputation, but he's not a bad character. He actually is incredibly powerful. It's just trying to find out how you can still make him relatable when the rest of his world is all superheroes in the cities above, and he rules a vast kingdom in the 70% of the earth that you and I never really get to see. All right, coming up next week, it's our Christmas episode, and hey, you've all been asking for it. Might just be time for me to take a look at Jim Lee's artwork. Jim Lee and Christmas? Yeah, they go together, believe it or not. So get ready for that next week. We're going to close out the year with a really fun episode. Until then, keep reading comics.